Hello, welcome to Southampton Assurance. Today we'll be discussing the business D Merton and their engagement with Primintel.
So just a brief history about D Merton. It's a highly profitable technology company, and in 2011 it made over 400 million in revenue. This was harnessed with the launch of their revolutionary technology, the S1, behind their radar system. They then later launched a series of other versions, the S1B and C, and made plans to launch another, the S1D.
In 2012, D Merton was at a near collapse. In the end, 3 senior executives were the centre of a bribe and fraud scheme which led to the ultimate arrest of their CEO, head of global sales, and the termination of the head of IT. They exemplified a lack of governance, but also a lack of oversight by their appointed external auditors.
We will now conduct a performance evaluation of those involved before we draw conclusions about who and what led to the near collapse. Our evaluations are based on the actions or lack thereof by the actors and placed within the relevant laws, codes and standards governing their role.
A board of directors represents the face behind a company's corporate governance, i.e. the mechanics and processes by which it is controlled. D Merton, being a listed company, is subject to comply with the listing rules that requires compliance with the Financial Reporting Council's UK Corporate Governance Code. The code gives guidance on standard practice in relation to leadership, effectiveness and accountability. The Companies Act 2006 also has provisions that they should adhere to. The board of D Merton is seen to fall short in several areas relating to this code and company law.
The code speaks of effectiveness, saying the board and its committee should have the appropriate balance of skills, experience, independence and knowledge of the company to enable them to discharge their respective duties and responsibilities effectively. This is also similar to Companies Act duties of directors to exercise reasonable care, skills and diligence.
The non-executive directors of D Merton were relatively dismissive in board meetings and decisions. Being on the board of a technology company, they seem to have little knowledge of the business and therefore struggle to understand the risky situations that were made. Liz, head of audit and risk committee, is a perfect example of showing a lack of knowledge concerning the company's risks, which is ironic since she was the head of the company's risk committee. She showed lack of awareness of the technicalities of the system, being complacent of the security risk, and avoided challenging previous assurance by the auditors, IT's experts, arguing, "We shouldn't second guess your expertise."
Alison, member of non-executive directors, also placed judgment for technology solely from auditors' investigations. She neglected the security risks and was more concerned over financing. FRC recommends that non-executive directors should devote time to developing knowledge of the company to ensure that they make positive contributions to the board. Being well informed about the company and having a strong command of the issues relevant to the business is important, and D Merton's non-executives don't seem to have sufficient knowledge of the company's issues to challenge the decisions of the audit team and executive directors.
Charles almost entirely played an invisible role throughout the company's board meetings. His silence automatically translated to an agreement to the decisions being made by the executive directors and his non-executive peers. The only substantial involvement he conducted under his duty as non-executive director was where Charles was asked by Liz to look at the auditor's expert report concerning the impairment increases. His advice led to Liz's belief that the company should ignore the revenue forecast as a risk concern. Apart from this, Charles said and did little. It appears Charles only found his voice when the issue of the senior executives being investigated for fraud and bribes relating to the contracts arose. During the Audit and Risk Committee meeting, he vocally expressed that the company should carry out their own investigation and that external experts should be used instead of internal audit. This was later agreed by all.
We believe the lack of board effectiveness of D Merton lies within the role of the chairman, Roger. According to FRC Codes of Governance, the chairman is responsible for ensuring effectiveness of all aspects of its role. He is responsible to set the agenda, ensure information is timely, and encourage a culture of openness and debate.
Roger, being recently appointed as chairman of the company in 2011, seemed to struggle to step into his legitimacy as chairman. He was not an existing member of the board, which seemed to create a bit of animosity within the board. As the new chairman, his concerns and viewpoints were not equally shared by others. Instead of carrying out a point of leadership, he went with the majority and tried to please everyone. His proposal to not reappoint TYSL auditors for the next engagement, being concerned over the length of time D Merton had been associated with them, was quickly brushed away by others.
In the board meeting on the 26th of March, Roger was the only one that believed the option to replace the central IT system instead of opting for a simpler patch was easier in terms of spreading the costs over a longer period. He was also concerned that the board was not aware of critical issues that Richard, the CEO, had acknowledged about the options. When the S1 deadline was forced to be delayed due to design issues, he was puzzled as to why the board had not been notified early on the issues.
The board's effectiveness of D Merton was entirely missing.
An effective board should be able to challenge each other's opinions and break the tendency towards group thinking. This was not seen in D Merton's board meeting. Those who were vocal in their opinions usually became the consensus and decision of the group. This was partly due to the lack of tone setting by the chairman. The role of the chairman should create the conditions for overall committee effectiveness.
Roger failed to set the tone at the top. The code also talks about leadership and corporate governance, together with the duties proposed by Companies Act to directors. The senior executives of D Mertons were Amisha, Chris, Alex, Tom and Richard.
Section 174 of the Companies Act states that directors should exercise independent judgment. The directors of D Merton did not always exercise this duty.
Chris, the head of IT, had his independent judgment varied by the judgment and opinions of others. Chris warned about choosing the option to fix the cybersecurity that was just a patch, but the directors were concerned about the cash flow and chose the cheaper option. Chris, being the expert on IT, should have done more to educate the board of the seriousness of the risk and should have persuaded them to choose option 1. He was also in control of the development of the S1D launch. He issued contracts to suppliers to complete each stage. Unfortunately, Chris was intimidated by Tom to include another supplier, despite all contracts already being issued. Tom threatened to blackmail Chris about an extramarital affair. As a result, Chris was pressured to authorise this payment to Premintel to save his marriage.
Directors also have a duty to not take or accept bribes. Both Richard and Tom failed this duty. For the new Genaria contract, Tom convinced Richard to use the false assurance of the bogus company, Premintel, to win the tender. As the leader, Richard's interests were not always aligned with the interests of the company. Although Richard was concerned about hitting profit targets, which were beneficial for the firm, he was also willing to do this at any cost. He used intimidation tactics towards other members of the board, including trying to convince Alex to not disclose information to the audit committee, and towards the auditors, where he was defensive over allegations about his relationship with Premintel. This was poor leadership on both their parts, because in their capacity as directors, it is a crime to do this. As a result, when the bribes were unveiled, they both were investigated and faced criminal charges.
Lastly, directors have a duty to exercise reasonable care, skill and diligence. There were few directors seen to exercise this role. The main objective for accountants is to meet the public's interests. It is vital for accountants to act within an ethical code and represent a high moral ground and rules of conduct and values. It is an absolute ethical requirement to remain independent and practice a degree of professional skepticism and professional judgment when assessing financial statements according to the IAASB. In regards to the D Merton case, there was an explicit breach of all the aforementioned standards, overall causing an extremely high detection risk.
The Audit Committee overall reached Section 3 of the ICAEW in terms of their lack of independence, integrity, lack of competency and disobedience to keeping to the technical standards. Dan Summers exemplifies dishonesty and lack of competency and asked to look over Premintel's reports. Not going over the reports with the required care and consideration led to a vital missing link in identifying the potential conflict of interest between D Merton CEO Richard and Premintel. Although this may be a vital feature leading to the downfall of D Merton, this lack of care and consideration is the tone set at the top of the audit committee, from the likes of Patrick, who was the audit partner, and Joe Russell, who exemplify a lack of independence and minimal professional judgment.
It could be argued that Patrick gave in to the intimidation threat from Richard as he expressed utter disagreement with Sarah's query, encouraging a lack of inquiry. This intimidation threat carried on to encourage Sarah to dismiss a suspicion regarding Richard's connection. Joe also mirrored this dismissive lack of professional judgment in taking Richard's word and encouraging Sam to not look any further.
Patrick has influence over Sarah's decisions when she is supposed to use her own professional competency to act. On phone to Patrick, she speaks to him before making decisions on what to do, which breaches objectivity. This influence also led to Patrick reaching advocacy through defending Richard's links to Primentown, and Sarah was influenced to stop her investigations into Primentown.
Sarah also had suspicions of Primentown and wanted to disclose this to Liz in the audit committee, but Patrick convinced her not to, so she would save her own back. This demonstrates her acting in her own self-interest rather than showing integrity and professional behaviour, despite initially not wanting to do that.
Threats to Sarah's independence may have been caused by Richard Dalton's intimidating presence, when he tries to intimidate Sarah for writing down the valuation of D Merton, causing her to possibly act differently to how she would have under other circumstances. Sam Keating led us to understand the lack of control and poor governance of senior auditors. She shows the lack of trust by telling Dan to not disclose that she is inquiring information about Primentown.
Overall, these auditors exhibit a lack of independence and competency in accordance with Section 3 of the ICAEW.
So we have two very special guests from the Financial Conduct Authority. They've been investigating independently what happened in D Merton, and they're going to tell us who they think was solely responsible and where it all went wrong. Who do you believe were the key characters when it came to D Merton's failures?
I think there are Roger, Tom, Patrick, and Sarah.
Okay, and where do you think that these people went wrong?
Okay, so I believe that ultimately what went wrong with D Merton is their lack of tone setting at the top. I believe that was very crucial to their collapse, in the fact that the leaders of both the audit team and the directors, the board of directors, didn't show that essential leadership that they needed to have at the top, and that led to the collapse of their entire team failing to do what they were meant to do. Also, I believe that there were a lack of independent judgment within the audit team.
Sarah, being the head of the audit team, did not exercise an independent judgment when making decisions, but relied on Patrick to lead her decisions.
Who do you think had their independence most skewed?
Richard, obviously one of them. Him being, the leader, the CEO, he allowed Tom, the head of their global sales, to kind of influence him to use Primental again for false assurance. Richard should have used this judgment to know that it wasn't good, and obviously that it leads to criminal offenses. So in that aspect, I think that he could have done better. When it comes to the auditors as well, I believe that the actors lacked independent judgment, specifically with Sarah. I feel that she was intimidated by Patrick, and because of that familiarity there between Patrick and Richard, she kind of felt in between, and her independent judgment kind of fall within the wayside with that.
Now, you mentioned the familiarity threat. Would you say that this affected the audit team?
Yes, I do think this affected the audit team a lot. Obviously, with the chairman, he wanted to change the auditors, and they thought that, with Sarah being the head of the engagement team, this will kind of be relaxed, but it obviously wasn't, because the familiarity was still there.
Would you say, out of the audit committee, who would you say is solely to blame if we had to pick?
I will say Sarah, with her being the lead of the engagement this year. I believe that she should have done more to disassociate herself with Patrick and not allow Patrick's opinions to affect her personal judgment. there were situations where she felt it in her heart that it was the
Yes.
right thing to do, but because Patrick came in and started questioning her, do you really think you should do that? Yeah, it kind of messed with her.
Yeah.
And obviously she should have done more with her team. With Dan being new, she should have make sure that he was doing the right thing. So as the leader of the audit team, I believe that she was solely responsible for her team, not
Practicing professional skepticism.
exactly.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So all in all, who would we all agree with to say who is to blame for the D Merton false assurance?
As all that we mentioned before, but I think the specific things, as in what
Yes.
caused the near collapse, are things like the tone at the top, lack of independent judgment, and professional skepticism. I would say those three led to the near collapse of D Merton.
So to answer our question today, who and what was to blame for D Merton's false assurance, we can conclude that Richard is probably the sole person we can blame. And what? We would say lack of professional skepticism, lack of professional judgment, and the tone from the top.
Thank you for watching.